Well, I want to thank Liz Nelson and Barb Knight for their activities and what they've done to help me get started here. I'm going to tell you a little story here. Before I go any further, I feel fortunate to be here tonight. About 2 weeks ago, I went out to get my car e-checked. And while I was there in the room waiting to see if the car passed or didn't pass, there was a couple other gentlemen there, and I noticed one of them, I had the World War II hat on, cap, and I noticed one of them kept staring at me, and you feel like somebody's really staring at you, and you don't know what that's all about. So he was about ready to leave, and I was about ready to get my car passed, and he came over and he looks at my hat. He just stared at it right here, and he said, "Not many of you guys left, are there?" And before I could say anything else, he said, "You guys are dropping off like flies." And he was making my day for me. But at any rate, he said, "How old are you?" And I said, well, I'd been a little shocked about all this. I said, "Well, give me about 30 days or so, I'll be 90 years old." He said, "Boy," he says, that's pretty old." And he turned around and left the place. Well, I thought, well, maybe I should get my body e-checked instead of the car, I went home and told Jan, I said, maybe we ought to eat early tonight. I don't know what I'm going to make today. But at any rate, I want to welcome all of you people, World War II, whatever war you were in, and all your families and so forth that are here. And what a beautiful, beautiful group of people you are. I'm going to run through some of this stuff. I'm not going to hurry, but I'm not going to take a lot of time to spend. But when Mrs. Nelson, Liz Nelson, asked me to speak to you this evening about some of the experiences I had in World War II, about 12, 13 years ago, I guess it was, a gentleman from the Library of Congress Veterans History Project in Washington, D.C. called me. And he said he asked me if he could come out and interview me. And I'm wondering, why? And he never would tell me his name or the name of the person that he was referring to. So, and I never ever found it out, what it was. But at any rate, he did come out to Medina and he interviewed me for about 3 hours. He made double tapes for my 4 children and 2 for Jan and me, and still have them. He said it would be the information would always be on the internet. Well, I never ever checked it. My son, one of my sons, did check it and it was there, but I never knew really what it was all about. But at any rate, I'm going into I was raised in a small town in central Illinois, and I was only 17 years old as a senior in high school, and at that time the age for drafting was 18 to 36, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know which part of the services that I would want to go to, but something happened that made me make a decision. My brother was older than I was, and he went into the Marines. He was in the 1st Marine Division, trained on the West Coast, and his unit, his 1st Marine Division company, was ready to ship out and go to the Pacific, South Pacific, Solomon Islands and that area, and they did go. He didn't go with them because he had some kind of a problem with a birth certificate. So that company went, and he found out a little bit later he was held up for about a month more to go till he went. He was held up. And that company that he was to be in were annihilated in one of the islands. So it was a favorable thing that happened to him. Very fortunate. His unit, I forget what island it was, but I knew that then that I didn't really want the jungle fighting. I thought, well, maybe the Navy is the best unit for me. So I was a minor, and I needed their permission. They needed permission from my parents in order for me to get into the Navy. So my dad, and I'll never forget as long as I live, my dad, I remember him signing the papers for me, a 17-year-old high school kid, to go in the Navy at that time. And so the friend told me, he says, so through tears and broken hearts, they signed and put me in the hands of God. That's the way one of my neighbors had put it at that time. Anyway, I left. When I left, my diploma was on the stage, and they tell me that it had a star hanging above it. And I went about 2 days after I signed. So I was just gone, that's the way they did in those days. And I look at these young high school guys, and I think about them, and I think about how the times were at that time. And boy, am I pleased you're not going to have to, that you aren't going and be drafted or anything like that. So to make a long story short, I went to boot camp, left the boot camp. As soon as I left boot camp, I was sent to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego, and went to what they call parachute school. Some of them call it parachute material schools. We learned all the phases there were pertaining to parachutes, the packing of them, fire and rescue equipment that was to be used around aircraft. And it was a good school. It was 10 weeks. But then they sent me to Camp Gillespie, which was a Marine paratrooper base. And I never really figured that out, but I've heard a lot of oddball things about what's happened in the military. But the honor of being the top graduate of that parachute school was to go and train with the Marine paratroopers for several days at Camp Gillespie. And they were a rugged bunch. But there we did tower jumps, and the honor that I had as being number one was to pack my own chute and be the first guy to bail out of an airplane. And I wasn't a very big guy. I was in good physical condition because I played a lot of athletics in high school. But I was the first guy to bail out in that airplane, about 3,000 feet, and I was the last guy to hit the ground. Seriously. So you know how heavy I was. So right after that, they sent me back to North Island Naval Air Station, and I was assigned to a carrier aircraft service unit. Now, a carrier aircraft service unit was different than most of the service guys I knew. They had to go into it, but the carriers had two complements of Navy personnel. They had a ship's company, which ran the actual ship, and then they had an air group that did the business of an aircraft carrier, namely flying, bombing, reconnaissance, missions, total missions of all types and kinds, and close support of the troops ashore. A carrier aircraft service unit, I was assigned to Air Group 6. And the total air group had about 200 officers and 135 enlisted men. That's what were needed to have an air group. There would be a squadron of dive bombers, a squadron of torpedo planes, a squadron of fighter bombers, a squadron of fighter planes. And the dive bombers were the old SBD Dauntless dive bomber, or the SB-2C Helldiver, which came on later. And the torpedo planes were TBFs and TBMs. As we moved time-wise, we would get newer types and kinds of airplanes. The fighter bombers were fighter planes that were fit so that they could carry bombs on the outside. And the F-4U Corsair, that blue middle plane right down here, was the Corsair. That was the fighter plane, one of the finest fighter planes that was ever made. All those planes were beautiful planes, and they really were powerful planes. So we held our own ground normally when we supported troops and so forth. Now, an air group is formed and then assigned to a carrier. And the air group to which I was assigned had previously served on 6 major carriers early in the war. The first one was at Pearl Harbor on the Lexington, which was a very famous aircraft carrier. It was the first, Air Group 6 was the first to shoot down any Japanese planes at Pearl Harbor, and several planes in the area. After being in battle areas for a certain length of time, the air groups would be reformed and reassigned, depending upon how many people they lost and so forth. So they were, our Air Group 6 was the first air group to be formed, and they were on the Enterprise, the Saratoga, the old Hornet, the old Wasp, which was sunk. I had a buddy on that, and the Intrepid, which was torpedoed, and then you got to the Hancock. I was assigned to VB-6, which is a dive bombing squadron, and which was Curtiss Helldivers, SB-2C Curtiss Helldivers. I was on standby status as an air crewman and in fire and rescue details and a parachute rigger. I was the main parachute rigger for the air group, not just VB-6. After a number of weeks of training on the West Coast, to all of the United States Navy air bases on the West Coast, we were there training at one time or another. I was the last one was Santa Rosa, California, and we went there for desert flying and night flying training. And at night flying, it was easier to fly. It was very quiet, and the air was clear there. But at any rate, I was then assigned to an aircraft carrier, which was the USS Hancock. The Hancock was a 27,100-ton displacement vessel. It was about 888 to 900 feet long, and 93 feet beam. It was a 147 foot flight deck, and it traveled at high speeds of 33 knots for a big ship. There were a complement of 3,400 people to be aboard that. Now, they didn't always have 3,400 people, but that's how many it could carry. It carried 12 5-inch guns, carried 44 40-millimeter guns, carried 59 20-millimeter guns, and it was an Essex class. Now, I know one person here, Dick Stauffer, sitting in the back row, was on the Philippine Sea, and it was an Essex class carrier. He was on after I was. He probably looks as old as I did, but he wasn't as old as I am. Sorry about that, Dick.
It's all right, you forget it.
Yeah, I'll pay for it in the long pull. So anyway, that was how I was assigned to a carrier, and if you want to ask a question, you can. We left the States on a troop ship called the General E.T. Collins, and that was quite an experience. There was about enough room to, well, you could sleep on the steel decks if you could find a place to sleep, because it was full of troops going to the different islands and going to Hawaii. So we went to Hawaii on what all the troops aboard called them Kaiser coffins. Because at that time, as you remember, after the war, Kaiser made cars, Kaiser Fraser automobiles. Well, Kaiser made troop ships at that time. And when you were going on high seas, you'd hear that boom, boom of the metal, the walls of the ship. You never knew when the walls were going to cave in on that thing, and we were scared to death, I think. The submarines were around at that time, and they would announce the sub had been spotted at a certain place, so that we were really scared. At any rate, we got to Hawaii, and that was quite an experience, and we were amazed at the destruction at the time of the naval yards, and what was impressive was this 1,177 sailors on the Arizona, down in the Arizona when it was sunk. 3-4 weeks ago, I read in the paper about the oldest living crew member of the battleship Arizona to have survived the attack on Pearl Harbor died. Commander Joe Langdell, 100 years old, and he was the last guy that had served and was on it that day. We were in pretty bad shape Navy-wise at that time because through several battles, like the Battle of the Coral Sea, and some of those battles we got pretty badly punished and lost several ships in those battles. But the Battle of Midway, I think at that time was probably the turning point in the Pacific War as far as naval action was concerned. Air Group 6 off of Carrier Enterprise, which was the first carrier that we had there, they sank 3 Jap carriers at Midway Battle, and that was the turning point of the war in that area. VT-6, which is the torpedo squadron. Now we were all together, the torpedo squadron, the bombers, our bombers and so forth. We were like a high school or a college football team. We were very, very closely related. We knew every officer in each one of the squadrons. We knew the personnel, the enlisted personnel, and it was really a pleasure to serve with all these guys, but yet you always feared that you would lose some. But at any rate, Air Group 6 sent VT-6, the torpedo squadron, out down at the Battle of the Midway, and out of the 14 planes that went out, torpedo planes, 4 returned. Air Group 6, but they had sunk so much Japanese naval ships that they became a very famous air group. I want to, let's see, where are we here? Oh, these guys, there are 6 guys here in that picture. I want to mention something to you. The 6 guys, you probably might recognize these guys. I was with them every step of the way from the very beginning of the time I got into Air Group 6 till the end of the war, and we came back. 3 of us came back out of that 6. You might recognize the one who's in the front here. The older guys that watched Have Gun Will Travel, Paladin. That was Richard Boone. Richard Boone was about 7 years older than I was, and he decided to be my big brother or my dad or something, because he took care of me like nobody ever did. He was a man with a booming voice. He taught me to play poker, and he was going to Stanford University before he got in the Navy. I was talking to somebody earlier about this. He was going to Stanford University, and he and a buddy decided to get a burlap bag and fill it with straw, pour ketchup all over it, which they did, got in the bushes on the main drive into the administration building at Stanford, threw it out in front of this car coming by. Well, it happened to be the limousine that Herbert Hoover's wife was in. Well, for you younger people, Herbert Hoover was President of the United States, but Herbert Hoover also was a president at Stanford University. But anyway, he got thrown out immediately. I mean, he didn't laugh. He used to laugh about that, and I loved to hear him laugh because he had such a booming, big laugh. Just a moment, well, at any rate, he was just a top-flight individual, was the turret gunner for the skipper of the torpedo squadron, had been on the Enterprise, and had been on, I forget the other carrier that he had been on, but he'd been on, this was his third time around to be in Air Group 6 on a carrier. And so he decided he did know more than anybody else in our young group of guys. So he was also, his voice was beautiful. He was in The Medic. He was in about 60 other TV shows at one time or another. When they had the 150th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln, his anniversary, at Lincoln Memorial in Washington, he was chosen to give the Gettysburg Address to the nation. And I loved the guy. But I never could win at poker. Anyway, we left and we'd gone to Hawaii, and it was a pretty sad place, really, at that time. One thing I want to mention was President Roosevelt had appointed Chester Nimitz to be the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet shortly after December 7th. Chester Nimitz flew to Hawaii on Christmas Eve, 1941, and immediately took a tour of the island and the battle area there where we were all blown up. And he came back with a report that everybody was totally shocked, because at the time there was such a spirit of despair and dejection and defeat that we didn't know what was going to happen. And he made the statement, and I'm going to read this statement here if I can. Said the Japanese made 3 of the biggest mistakes an attack force could ever make. And he asked that question to people, and people didn't know how the answer was, but he said, they asked him, what were the mistakes? He said, mistake number 1, the Japanese attacked on Sunday morning. 9 out of every 10 crewmen of those ships were ashore on leave. If those same ships had been lured to sea and been sunk, we would have lost 38,000 men instead of 3,800. And he said, mistake number 2, when the Japanese saw all those battleships lined in a row, they got so carried away sinking those battleships, they never once bombed our dry docks, which were opposite of those ships. And if you guys, I'm sure all of you almost have been to Hawaii and gone out through Ford Island and that area where the planes came in and bombed the Arizona and all these other ships. And it was just a massive clutter of terrible scenery when you see all those beautiful ships that were just blown all to heck. But at any rate, He said that they had talked about the 38,000 men that would have been lost instead of 3,800. He said mistake number 2, when the Japanese saw all those battleships lined in a row, they got so carried away sinking those battleships, they never once bombed our dry docks opposite those ships. And he said if they had destroyed our dry docks, we would have had to tow every one of those ships to America to be repaired. As it is now, the ships are in shallow water, can be raised. One tug can pull them over to the dry docks. We can have them repaired and at sea by the time we could have towed them back to America. Now, I don't know whether, I know all you guys probably, most of you have been a while, you know the dry docks were, my gosh, they were so close to where the Arizona lies underwater and all those battleships, just very, very close. And they didn't touch the dry docks, the Japanese didn't. It says mistake number 3, listen to this. Every drop of fuel in the whole Pacific theater of war is in the top of the ground storage tanks 5 miles over that hill. So one attack plane could have strafed those tanks and destroyed our fuel supply, total fuel supply. That's why I say the Japanese made 3 of the biggest mistakes an attack force could make, or God was taking care of America. And he was. This guy, Chester Nimitz, was a brilliant, brilliant admiral, and I have seen him when at time or two when I was out in Hawaii, and he's just loved by everybody. Now, I got to tell you something. First I have to explain to you Ulithi. How many of you guys been to Ulithi? Okay. Ulithi was nothing, it was a small atoll that was just actually very, very small. The only thing it consisted of was, they called it Mogmog Island. And they had a radio station and not much more than that. And it became a fleet anchorage for the U.S. fleet that since Pearl Harbor had become massive when I was there. As they moved toward Japan, it got worse. Everything got worse from a standpoint of our Navy getting bombed and so forth. But our fleet had become rather massive. You could be 2,000 to 3,000 feet in the air, and as far as you could see in any direction, you'd see naval vessels, supply ships, and other types and kinds of ships. It was just totally unbelievable what the people in the United States had done in such a short time to build up a fleet the way they built and the aircraft that they built and so forth. And we were becoming a pretty powerful United States Navy. So it always was wonderful to know that back in the States, the women were doing as much as the men in producing all this military hardware. There were all types and kinds of plants available, building planes and so forth. So that was a big help to everybody that was out in that area. But Ulithi, back to Ulithi, it was a fleet anchorage. It was a supply point, a replenishment supply point, and all were just ships, just supply ships and so forth came into Ulithi. That's one of the first places you went before you really went into heavy battle. And actually, it was about I suppose 7,000 miles from the United States, and just a Mogmog Island. First night I got off of that troop ship and got onto the Hancock. I hope I got this right, because the first night I was at Ulithi, at any rate, 2 planes came in and they got through all this massive power that we have, and one of them dived into the Randolph, which was just off our port side, dived into it, and a terrific explosion happened there. The other one mistook a small rocky island about the size of a ship. They mistook that for a carrier and dived into that rocky island. The Japanese guy got his eyes opened or closed at that time. But at any rate, that was my first. I guess that's probably the first time that I really knew about Japanese kamikazes. They would bomb at anything. Okay. Now let me see here. I got the notes here. As many of you know and been through it, the closer they moved toward Japan, the harder the Japanese fought. And we were attacking their homeland and so forth, so they didn't waste any time starting some kamikaze stuff, pretty active back in those days. I think the real first kamikaze attacks came, in our case, it came when we were in the Philippines, off the Philippines, with Lady Gulf, and the Battle of Lady Gulf, and that was when they really started sending those babies out in numbers, heavy numbers, to attack the carriers, and the carriers were what carried the airplanes that were attacking their homeland, and they didn't like that. So at any rate, they really started blasting us pretty bad, and from here on until the war's end, there were they counted 7,645 kamikaze attacks on our ships. And during that period of time, we had 120 ships hit, 3,048 naval personnel killed, and 6,025 wounded. So the next few months, they were really bombing each island held by the Japanese, as well as the mainland of Japan. Now, one of the most feared experiences that I had, or I thought was bad, occurred east of the Philippines. We had been bombing Luzon and the Luzon air bases and so forth. And Luzon, when we were bombing those people, we were 1,000 miles away from Ulithi, our replenishment point. So it was Ulithi would have been southeast of the Luzon area in the Philippines. So we had to find a way of getting supplies back to, all the types and kinds of supplies that our fleet needed were there in Ulithi, and we couldn't go back there. So it was decided that they would go, that our fleet, which consisted at that time, were 7 huge Essex-class carriers, 6 light carriers, 8 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 56 destroyers. Now, the 3rd Fleet's at-sea logistics group had to try to rendezvous with 27 oilers, 7 ammunition ships, 8 escort carriers, 14 destroyers, 25 destroyer escorts, and 7 seagoing fleet tugs. We had to find a way of replenishing what we had lost. So the problem was that when we left the Luzon area bombing the airfields, our planes were in the air, and they were trying to get rendezvoused with this logistics fleet in that area off the Philippines, east off of the Philippines. Well, it happened, and I know that Dick Stauffer went through this on the Philippine Sea. I think we ran into a typhoon, and a typhoon in that area, they claimed that they'd have like 5 or 6 a year, but the winds could be up as high as 130 miles an hour. I don't think it was quite that high, but it was high enough that our pilots couldn't land the planes, so they had to find other carriers a little bit distance away to land our planes there. It was just a horrible, horrible mess. They would tie cables or ropes around any personnel that was to go on the flight deck to keep them from being washed over. They said destroyers and that were light, didn't have much fuel on them, would be a subject of being sunk, and we did lose 3 destroyers in that typhoon. There was the Hull, the Magnanimum, and the Spence were capsized, and they lost. The next day they picked up a lot of them. There were, I think they said there were like 700 or something that were picked up that were lost in that typhoon. But they had to let the air out of the tires of the planes to keep them from washing over the side. So the typhoon was scary. And I think if you'd ever asked Dick Stauffer about that, he'd probably tell you that the Philippine Sea went through the same thing. And it was a dreadful thing. Bad, bad. We lost a lot of people there. My time on a carrier was mostly spent managing the operation of what is known as a parachute loft. And the parachute loft was important because all the planes, all the pilots, all the crewmen had to have parachutes. Now in the Navy, when you packed a parachute, and I've never ever understood why this would be, but when you packed a parachute, you had to sign a tag that would go in a slot in the parachute. And I can remember one day a lieutenant commander came to me and said, are you people signing those tags in the parachute? I said, absolutely, that's the rule. But I couldn't go farther with a statement because I thought, well, if a dead-gone parachute doesn't open, who's going to question it? You know, but they had that rule, so the people had to sign it. In that parachute loft, it was a long room and a big roof with a lot of long tables, and they could take a complete parachute and take it from the shroud lines on all the way up and pack it and have room to do it with the length, you know, they fold it over a proper way. And it was all the work, all the types of work for flying equipment and pilot aviation equipment was done there. And we had heavy machinery. There were large sewing machines and other types of machines where they repaired the parachute harness, etc. But every chute had to be repacked within certain time standards. Like they had to be packed in 30 days or less, unless they were in an area where the moisture was higher and so forth. So it was part of an important job, and I had about 5 or 6 parachute riggers that did most of the work. I was on standby air crewman status, and I had to go to all the ready room meetings for the pilots. Give you an idea how chaotic it was when on a carrier when you have all the ordnance being loaded on the airplanes and fuel, etc. It was very, very dangerous. A typical day would be a 350 reveille, 400 be breakfast, 500 be flight quarters, where you had to be ready to go wherever you're going. 6 o'clock would be a standby for a launch strike, where each plane had to know what size bomb, whether it was a delayed fuse, or an instant fuse, They had 250, 500, 1,000-pound bombs going these planes, and then like at 8:30 would be the first launch, and at 12:30 there'd be another launch, and then they'd even have a land about number, which are like 12:45 for the first launch and 15:45 for the second launch. Bad things happened when you're on a flight deck of a carrier. When you're loading ordnance, you're loading everything, and the propellers are spinning, and guys are running around. They were responsible for one certain plane or two certain planes, and it was not a very pleasant place to be. They had planes coming in after the launches were made, and they're coming back in the evening. There are a number, you've probably seen it on TV a lot of times, the aircraft coming in and the wheels go bad or something, and the plane would be damaged. And when we were at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, in that area where it was so bad, and we were under general quarters just about all the time, if a plane came in and had a wheel landing gear that would be broken or a wing scratch or something, they'd shove it over the side. They'd bring in new planes because they couldn't afford to not, the aircraft carrier did not stop for anything. They kept going. If you ran I saw a guy one time drive one of the propelled units that they pulled airplanes around on the flight deck. I saw him drive the thing off a deck edge elevator into the ocean. Carrier keeps going. Destroyer, call a destroyer, and they pick the guy up and bring him back to the ship at a time when he could be brought back. On I think it was the 21st of January or February, we had a flight of aircraft coming in for landings, and the landing signal officer saw an F-6F, that's a fighter bomber. And a fighter bomber would have bombs. If they were aboard, they were put on with lug bolts and so forth on the outside under the wing. Well, this F-6F had a hung bomb on the aircraft. And there was a 500-pound bomb that was supposed to have dropped during the bombing run that didn't get off the plane. So it was hanging from one lug. Everybody could see it that was watching up there. The landing signal officer waved the plane off, but the pilot refused the wave off and landed. Now, about 100 men were rushing and gathering to go to the plane and try to get that bomb off how it was bolted on. The plane, they were rushing at a plane to try to stop the pilot from going any further and try to take the bomb off. The pilot disregarded everyone's hand signals to stop, and as soon as his tail hook was free of the arresting gear, he taxied forward, then stopped for the onrush of all these guys that are running on the deck, and the lug gave way and the bomb detonated. There were 50 killed and 75 injured in that deal there. It was just a chaotic, crazy place to be. And when we were at general quarters, always from before sunrise and usually after dark, till after dark. We were kept well informed as what was taking place because they had a fleet of guard dog destroyers, or pickets they call them. Sometimes they call them tomcats, that would be 60 miles out surrounding the fleet. And they would call in if 50 aircraft were coming in, Japanese kamikazes, they would call and let them know. And so the fleet would be ready for that. And occasionally some would get through. On the 19th, I still remember this vividly. On the 19th of March, a buddy of mine, Johnny Cohn, and I were out on the flight deck. There was a catwalk that went around the edge of the flight deck. You guys on the carriers can probably remember that. And Johnny Cohen and I were, about 6 o'clock, we're having a cup of coffee, standing there watching our plane load bombs and ammunition and gasoline and so forth. We didn't want any part of being up there with where they were running around. But anyway, we were on the deck edge elevator area near the catwalk, and I saw one lone plane coming in a distance, and this was early in the morning. And I told Johnny Cohen, I said, there's something fishy about this deal. There's a plane coming in, and he's coming in the wrong direction for takeoff, so it's nothing to do with the USS Franklin taking planes off, and they're loading fuel and ammunition and so forth on the port side. We were on the port side of our ship, and we questioned all that bit going on while munitions were being loaded. And about that time, there was the loudest and largest explosion that I had ever seen then and since. And it was the worst damage without the ship being, it was the worst damage of any carrier in World War II without being sunk. They lost 852 were killed, 750 injured in that explosion. It was horrible because so many of them were missing. They got many of them, the ship on the back, on the fantail, was burning, and many of them had to leave the carrier, dive over, and hopefully destroyers would pick them up. But it was the worst catastrophe as far as any carrier out there that did not get sunk. It was just horrible. We had destroyers bring them aboard our ship. I mentioned the fact that you had to pack, you had to sign when you packed a parachute. And I always thought, why? If it doesn't open, who's going to know? But when I was in parachute school, we packed the chutes for the aviation people at North Island Naval Air Base. And I know of 2 occasions where 2 pilots in separate incidents had to bail out. And my name was on both those cards. I'll never forget that, because one of them was a lieutenant commander, and he came in, and I mean, he just didn't think he could do enough for me. He got his chute. He landed in a tree and hung there for quite a while. And once he got down, he opened that the chute and pulled this out, and my name was on it. And he came to thank me for packing that parachute for me while I was at school. That was nice, but he'd never allow any parachute rigger to touch his parachute. He and I were together from the beginning of the air group. He's in that picture. I was loft manager just about all the bases that I was there. Jake had a thing about the safety and care of his parachute. He would say, Phoebus, I know you have a tough, strict, superior records to be responsible for, but I know how important that chute is to me, and I don't want anybody but you to pack my chute and take care of it. If I have to bail out and it doesn't open, I will come back and beat the hell out of you. Well, all the air group, the whole air group knew this story. Coming back from a bombing raid in Japan, one of our squadrons had some battle damage. They had a mid-air collision over Kagoshima Bay. One of these, well, I don't know where it is. It was old Kagoshima Bay, and it became quite a historical thing. But anyway, one of the squadrons, our squadron had a battle damage, and they had a mid-air collision off of the Japanese coast at Kagoshima Bay. Jake's plane was cut in half. Slim Somerville, who was the pilot of that plane, parachuted into the bay because he had tried to talk to Jake, and he was later saved. Another pilot, his name was Ed Went, I'll never forget him. He was an ensign and soon had become a lieutenant. That's another story, but that pilot came back on the carrier and told me the other parachute came down with half a man in it, but somehow it had opened. He said he flew around the chute 4 or 5 times, very close to check, and it was Jake. He knew our close relationship, wanted me to know that the chute had opened. He said, now Jake won't have to beat the hell out of you. Never forget that. Ed Went was an ensign when that happened. And he became a lieutenant, and very shortly after that happened, he went on a flight into Japan. He bullseyed a battleship and it sunk. The same guy that told me that about Jake. He hit the Nagata, which was a battleship, and he sunk it. Those things happened, and they're terrible things that happened, and you couldn't do anything about it. I can tell you, they talk about Japanese Betty bombers. Japanese Betty was a twin-engine bomber, and I was standing on the forecastle of our, on the flight deck of our carrier, and there were a bunch of us guys, just young guys. This Japanese Betty bomber was coming in off our starboard side, in front of the ship, and it just kept coming in, coming in, coming in. And everybody in the fleet was firing at it. The Cowpens, which was a light carrier, was off our starboard side about 200 or 300 yards. And it was right over the fantail of the Cowpens and right over, would have been right over the forecastle of our carrier. And that bomber kept rolling in, and everybody there was like a football game. Get the son of a gun, get him, yelling and screaming, all the guys on the carrier. You remember that? And finally, it must have got hit with a 5-inch shell in the left engine. And I will never forget it because nobody wanted to believe what we saw. But that plane came in so close to us that you could see the pilot and the co-pilot's face. I mean, it was clear. And all of a sudden, this rolls over like this, drops right between the front of our ship and the Cowpens carrier. It was just that close. That's what happened out there. Those guys would come in, they always came in out of the sun, especially the Jap Zeros, that plane on the bottom right over there, the great airplane, fast airplane. And they'd always come in out of the sun because you couldn't, you know, when you're looking up in the sun, it was hard to shoot and hard to hit them. But that's the way they always seemed to come in. And they would come in 300-400 miles an hour, I suppose, or 250, 500, something, not 500, but they would always come in, and boy, when they came in, they would be dead on to make there's pictures over there probably somewhere that shows that. But anyway, I forgot what I was after here. At any rate, that's what happened with some of those things. I have to tell you that I spent time in the ready rooms early in the morning listening to some of the pilots get briefed on their military, what they were supposed to do that day. And I enjoyed that because I knew what was going to be happening. But one morning I went in and I heard some of the pilots, they weren't complaining, they were just, you could tell there was a lot of stress. And they were going to, their mission was to go to Chichijima, a small island, to do their bombing run that day. And after we left there, one of the pilots said, "Oh boy," like that. Well, George Bush, the old man, George, he was the youngest Navy pilot in World War II. He was flying near Chichijima, and both the turret gunner and the normal guy, the radio man, got killed, and he bailed out. And he landed very close to Chichijima. And he was picked up by a submarine, which was wonderful that it happened. But there were others that weren't picked up by subs. And there was a feeling amongst the pilots and gunners that were to go on some of those flights that there were rumors that the commanders of Chichijima were performing cannibalism. And it scared the living daylights out of the pilots and so forth. And it did become a known fact among our shipmates that later on that was happening. On the 20th of March, we were refueling a destroyer called the Halsey Powell. Anybody on a destroyer on the Navy?
The library will be closing in 30 minutes.
The Halsey Powell.
We ask that you begin making your final selection.
Oh,
If anyone would like
okay.
to select a library card,
The Halsey Powell, we were refueling and so forth, and
thank you.
a Kamikaze, Zero, came charging in, was heading for both the Hancock and the Halsey Powell, and at about 400 feet above the flight deck, got hit, direct hit, and the fuselage landed on the deck. Engine and a bomb flew off and hit the fantail of the Halsey Powell destroyer, caught it on fire, the lines broke, and it took off. We almost ran over it. And there was another commie at the same time that was close to its release point of a run over the carrier, and he got shot down. Thing that bothers me about that is that a metallurgist picked up part of that fuel tank off that Kamikaze, made me the most beautiful watch band, engraved it, everything. And won't you know that I put that away in my house for safekeeping, and I haven't found it. And this has been 15, 20 years ago. I can't find it. Anyway, I'd love to have it back. It was beautiful. On the 7th day of April, all these pictures up there on the wall. A commie came charging in and cartwheeled the flight deck and crashed into a group of planes while its bomb hit the port catapult to cause a tremendous explosion. They killed 62 of our guys and wounded 71. There were a lot of heroic efforts that day, and I got to tell you something. Doug Estes and I, one of those guys, were just sitting in the parachute loft, I guess, because we were going to the flight deck and check on some parachutes. And so when the loudspeakers came on about bogies inbound like 3 miles, we grabbed equipment to go to some of the gun mounts. Doug said, See you, Phoebe. I'm going forward to the forecastle to check something up there. I never saw Doug again. The bomb blast occurred about the time Doug would have reached the hangar deck to go forward. Doug and I had joined Air Group 6 at the same time. I always sort of wondered why Doug went that way and not me, because sometimes that's what happened. So I guess I was lucky. At any rate, after the bomb blast, I rushed over to the port side gun mount to see if I could help in any way. There were 7 or 8 men in the mount, each exactly positioned like they were when the blast occurred. They looked like mannequins. They were in an all nude mode. All the clothing was totally blown off or burned off. There were several personnel near the gun mount, and I reached to help. My immediate reaction was horrible. I was too shocked, I think, and scared to get sick, but everybody was sick. It was unbelievable. The bodies, and I've told this to 2 people. The bodies were totally baked, like roast pork would be baked, I guess. If you helped to get these bodies out of the gun mounts, your hands would sink in like the most horrible thing I ever got involved in. Ship was on fire for a number of hours. The Japs were sending out many planes to finish us off. And the planes from other carrier were fighting off the kamikazes that were coming in. Our planes had to land on other carriers. Just a horrible mess. And I have to tell you something. When I tell that story, that there are no atheists at that time in gun mounts or foxholes. But I have to tell you something else that freaking me out today, is that there's a freedom group that object to prayers on Navy ships. They protested the tradition of evening prayers on Navy vessels. Now, I'm not going further with that, but I'm going to tell you that if some of the things happening today were happening on that ship, I will guarantee you that there would be men overboard, and they would have stayed overboard. They wouldn't even call a destroyer. They just, that's all I'm saying. Anyway, it wasn't the same. For years, I couldn't, when I'd go into a shopping mall, I'd go to a shopping mall and there were mannequins in there. I couldn't look at them. I just walked by and I couldn't look at them. And that's because of that gun mount. I can still see that gun mount. Wasn't good. We got blown up and they sent us back to Pearl Harbor for rest and relaxation after that happened. And we went to the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. Of course, it wasn't nice as it was now, but we had a great time. And a good thing that happened was that I ran into Buck Havener, a kid I'd played high school football with and known all my life. He was on the, we went for 10 days along with a submarine crew that had been down for about 60 days. You talk about a wild group of guys. I mean, they were it, but they were nice guys. I mean, we had a good time with them, and Buck took me to the submarine base in Hawaii, and he took me down in a sub. First time I'd ever been in a sub, and the last time. But he went down in a sub, and it was quite an experience being with that group. Everybody got along fine, but we were warned by our commanding officer going back to Hawaii, don't mess with those guys because they're a tough breed of cat and they've been down under the water for about 60 days or maybe a little longer, and they'll tear you apart. So we behaved ourselves pretty much. I had another buddy, good buddy, came to visit me after the war. He's from Everett, Washington, and he came back to Illinois to go to Northwestern University. And just briefly, I'll tell you, Bob Mollison, he's the one that put together these brochure things. Anyway, Bob was shot down in one of the bays off of the coast in Japan. And he got picked up by a couple of seaplane off of a cruiser and brought him back. He got back in the carrier about 10 days later. Oh boy. Well, anyway, as you move closer to Japan, the tougher it got. And I will leave some of this stuff off that I know about. The signing of the Missouri was in Tokyo Bay. The English Duke of York, O'Bannon, 4 destroyers were the first to go in with the Missouri. And Missouri went in because Harry Truman was president and he was from Missouri. And it was this formal surrender. But anyway, we did go in there. They called us and we went in. And the planes flew low, covering the sides of the areas for gun mounts and so forth. To make a long story short, I was chosen along with 21 other Navy senior petty officers to go into Yokosuka Naval Air Base on what they called the first official Liberty Party to go ashore in Japan after World War II. And I don't know why they call that a Liberty Party, but they armed us and we went in to see what was going to happen and how we would be received. We were received in Yokosuka, and I got a lot of stuff, but I won't be able to read it. The city was totally destroyed, about 80%, and it was like you would expect. It was just a horrible situation as far as the people were concerned. They'd see us, if they were on the same kind of side of the street we were, they would move over to the other side of the street or hiss at us in some cases. And a lot of bicycles with kids, but they'd run and get on top of some of the properties that were there. Well, I got some things that I should tell you, but I can't. But anyway, I will tell you that on the 19th of August, the surrender was signed on the 2nd of September. The 19th day of August, they had, and never was spoken about, but they had the preparation of the surrender, pre-surrender of Japan. They secretly flew Japanese Betty planes that were repainted, and they flew them into, eventually got to General MacArthur in the Philippines. And there's more, but that's gonna tie it up. I enjoyed being here. I'm sorry I didn't get to tell you more things than I did, but time just goes so fast. I thank you very much for your attendance.